Well, I'm going to try to do the Victober challenge, but I'm not sure of getting it right. Hi, I'm Tim and I have too many books. One of the things I really enjoy about booktube is watching all the different challenge videos, and coming up in October is a challenge known as Victober. This is hosted by a number of booktubers and they issue mini challenges which will help you build a TBR, a to be read list, where you can indulge in Victorian literature. Now, I always want to try to do these things, but I have a slight problem in that I've got a very, very large TBR. If you think your to be read list is 30 and you think that's a lot, well, try multiplying that by 50 and you'll see about where I am. It means I'm on a bit of a schedule with my TBR, very much on my own, and I can't really sort of stop things and come up with a new list of books. However, I looked at my likely TBR for this October and discovered that, well, I do have one or two Victorian books coming up and I might be able to propose a possible TBR. Of course, for various reasons, I'm not going to get it entirely right because I made this big list years ago and it might not entirely fit, but I will be talking about a few books that I might be able to slot in while I read. Now, I'll go through some of the challenges that have been put forward. We start with Kate, who wants us to read a book with a chronic illness or disorder or disability represented in it. I have a couple of books that are possibilities there. Katie asks for a Bildungsroman or coming of age story. I do have a few things where young men progress through life, but it's not really people going from, say, boyhood or girlhood through adolescence into adulthood. Marissa wants us to read a Victorian short story. Now, I can kind of cheat on that because I can always whip out my complete short fiction of Wilkie Collins and read something like Mad Monkton or something. So Petra wants to read a Victorian book and watch the TV adaptation of it. I think I can do that, so we'll come to that one. And lastly, Ros wants people to read a work of poetry, Victorian poetry, long or short. Now, on another project, I am actually trying to learn some Lewis Carroll poems and possibly Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. So maybe I'll sort of try to push forward with those in October and see where I get. So let's talk about the books I think I might be able to get to in October. We start with 3 books by Leo Tolstoy. Now, is Tolstoy a Victorian author? I mean, certainly in terms of period he is, but when we talk about Victorian authors, we're often thinking more in terms of British authors, people who are actually reigned over by Queen Victoria rather than authors who were around at the time. But Leo Tolstoy is certainly within the Victorian times. I've read things like War and Peace and Anna Karenina, so I'm moving on to some of the other works, and I'm starting with The Cossacks, which is an 1863 novel, in which he talks about the Caucasian War, which was beginning to come to an end. Caucasian War, I didn't know an awful lot about. I looked it up. It is essentially a war where the people of the Caucasus, in this case Chechens, are resisting the building of the Russian Empire. And it really looks into the way that the Cossacks being used as troops against the Chechens work. I'm not sure that it's going to go into the complexities of that. And obviously, if you've been keeping your eye on the news in Russia over the past decade or so, you'll know that Chechen conflict is still very much something that's bubbling under and was something that was going on even back in the 1860s. In fact, I think the Chechen War, the Caucasian War, actually ran for almost 50 years up until the mid 1860s. So it's a really quite a long time for this conflict to go on, and a conflict that hasn't been entirely resolved. The next book is a shorter book by Tolstoy, which is The Death of Ivan Ilyich. This comes from 1886, and is about a young man who falls ill and is facing death, and how he copes with it, as far as I can see. This might fulfill Kate's idea of something where somebody has a chronic illness or a disability, but I think I might have a better one down the line. The last of the Tolstoys I plan to read is the Kreutzer Sonata. The Kreutzer Sonata is in fact a piece of music by Beethoven, and it is a piece that sort of enhances the jealousy of a man and causes him to attack his wife and her violinist accompanist, so to speak. I've seen this done as a play, and I'd be very interested to read it as a book, or novella in this case. The next book is Deerbrook by Harriet Martineau. Now, I was a little bit worried about whether or not this really counts as Victorian. It was published in 1838, and Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837, which means Deerbrook might have been underway before that. But that said, Harriet Martineau was already a fairly accomplished writer and a favourite of Queen Victoria before she came to the throne, and indeed she was, Harriet Martineau was invited to Queen Victoria's coronation, so I think she counts as Victorian, although she's probably late Georgian or late William IV, or even late Regency. The next book is The Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith. This is a book about Charles Petra, who decides that his musings, his diary, are very much worth listening to, even though he might be a nobody. I think I've read this before, or I've heard adaptations on the radio, so I do feel I know the book reasonably well already, although this might be a bit of a reread. One of the things that I found interesting about it, thinking about it, is that, like one or two other comic novels where the author begins by wanting to ridicule their main character, they end up quite liking them. This is particularly true, I think, in something like the Pickwick Papers, where Pickwick is a figure of ridicule to start off with, but eventually becomes somebody, well, almost quite heroic, although there's still plenty of comic elements within the book. Round about the time Sam Weller enters the book, I think that's what happens in Pickwick Papers. And much like that, I think that they may have wanted to, George and Weedon Grossmith may have wanted to ridicule Charles Petra, their main character, but in the end I think they come to quite like him. Now, one of the things I'd quite like to mention when you're talking about George and Weedon Grossmith is that George Grossmith was a soloist for the Dolly Cart Company. He worked with Gilbert Sullivan on some of their comic operas. I believe he played Coco in the original production of The Mikado. And if you want to see that, there's a film called Topsy Turvy, which features George Grossmith injecting himself with cocaine, I believe. But that's a very interesting. But Topsy Turvy is a very interesting film, especially about the making of The Mikado. Diary of a Nobody fulfills Petra's challenge for an adaptation of a Victorian work. There have been a couple of adaptations of Diary of a Nobody. There was one back in the late 1970s, which was a full cast version with Terence Hardiman as Charles Petra. Going back even further, in the 60s there was a very short version done by Ken Russell, which is done in black and white, which I think you can find on YouTube somewhere. But the version I shall mention is the 2007 version, adapted by Andrew Davis, the man who did your favourite version of Pride and Prejudice. He adapted it with Hugh Bonneville as Charles Petra. Now, some people say there's a bit of a problem with this version of the Diary of a Nobody, in that there's not much of anybody else. Hugh Bonneville is shown just after writing, or just considering his previous night's entry in the diary, and there's not an awful lot of other stuff to go round. There's not an awful lot of extra stuff other than a very nice set and one or two props. There's no other characters, no other people in the story, which is a bit of a pity really, because you would like to see it more fleshed out, but it probably would be a little bit too much. But all the same, it's a very good version, really gets you into the story and really tells you most of the book as far as I can tell. The next book I have is The Egoist by George Meredith. This is a book about a man called Sir Willoughby Patten, who attempts to get married, and his misadventures and the poor women who might end up married to him. I can't help feeling Willoughby Patten sounds a little bit like Willow Patten, and I wonder if that's a a deliberate play on words. After all, willow pattern china is often seen as a sign of sophistication, but it is so ubiquitous that perhaps it becomes the opposite. We then move on to The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. This is about a young man called Prince Mishkin, who is an epileptic, which means we tick off Kate's challenge for somebody with a disability. And it's about him getting involved in love affairs with two women, and really what happens to him throughout it. He is, of course, the idiot of the title. Dostoyevsky is somebody I have a problem with. It's not that I don't like his books. I've read the Brothers Karamazov and Crime and Punishment. It's just that I don't get him. Everyone talks about how great he is. Albert Camus wrote an entire book where he basically created a branch of philosophy based on the Brothers Karamazov. So I do wonder what I'm not getting. When I read Tolstoy's War and Peace, I got that. I got why he's so brilliant, but I never quite got why Dostoevsky is so brilliant. I mean, he's good, certainly. I mean, it's not that I think he's in any way bad. It's just that he's not fantastic and marvellous, which is often the way people characterise him. So I'll be interested to see if The Idiot tips the balance there. One of the challenges in this year's Victober is a group read of The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. Now, one of the reasons I'm not going to do this is, well, firstly, I've read it, but also that I'm hoping to read a couple of other Thomas Hardy books during October. The first of those is The Hand of Ethelberta. This is about a young woman, an adventuress, somebody who has reinvented herself from very humble upbringing, and she is out to find love and capture a man, as you have to in Victorian times. This is not a particularly popular Thomas Hardy book, possibly because apparently it doesn't have anybody dying or killing themselves or ending tragically. It's actually a reasonably happy ending. So maybe people think that Thomas Hardy has let himself down and let everybody else down by not being as miserable as he can be. My next Thomas Hardy book is Return of the Native, which is Hardy's 1878 book about a young man returning from Paris, where he has made a reasonable success of himself, but now wants to live a simpler life in his hometown, perhaps as a school teacher. And it's also about the effect that he has on people's lives. I believe there are deaths in this one, so Hardy is very much back on form, and it is one of Hardy's more popular books, I believe. The last book on my TBR is Bel-Ami by Guy de Maupassant. This is about a man who returns to Paris after spending time in the French army, serving in Algeria. He becomes a journalist and then starts creeping up the social ladder, becoming a great success, and is a somewhat satirical version of French society, I understand. So that could be a very interesting read. So that's my Victober picks, my Victober possible TBR. I hope I've fulfilled some of the criteria that are necessary to count as a proper Victober TBR, and we'll have to see if I actually manage them.